"Please don't fire me," she begged. What Mafia boss did next was shocking. My eyelids fluttered open, stirred awake by the strange sensation of silk sheets whispering across my skin. Far too soft and luxurious to belong to the cramped one-bedroom apartment I called home, the one with its eternally leaking ceiling and the incessant hum of an aging refrigerator that never quite shut up. The air here carried the unmistakable scent of expensive perfume, hints of sandalwood layered with something darker, more dangerous. Nothing like the lavender air freshener I had sprayed in hurried bursts around my place before stepping out last night. Last night, my 25th birthday. I sat up too quickly and paid for it with a sharp, splitting pain behind my eyes. The room spun briefly, then stilled, revealing itself in dizzying clarity. A vast bedroom with floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of Seattle, with the harbor glinting in the distance and soft hills stretching along the horizon. Morning light filtered through the half-drawn curtains, illuminating a space larger than my entire apartment. The furniture was dark wood, polished to a sheen. A crystal chandelier shimmered overhead. Paintings adorned the walls, each one looking like it had been handpicked from an art gallery. "Happy birthday to me," I whispered, voice catching as fragments of memory began to clash and collide. And then I realized I was not alone. Instinct made me yank the blanket up to cover myself. It became painfully clear that I wore nothing beneath the thin fabric. A cold shiver climbed my spine. I scanned the room in quiet panic, searching for clothes, a phone, my wallet, anything familiar, but there was nothing. Nothing I recognized. The sound of running water stopped. The bathroom door creaked open. And then he stepped out. The stranger. The man I had never seen before. Julian Maddox. I didn't know his name then. But later, that name would etch itself into my memory like a scar that never fully fades. He didn't look like the kind of man you'd be warned about. No menacing scars, no threatening scowl. Just a tall, broad-shouldered man with a towel slung around his hips, droplets of water still clinging to sun-bronzed skin, trailing slowly down the firm lines of his chest and stomach. His hair, wet and slicked back, revealed a face marked by a straight nose, angular jaw, and a pair of cold amber eyes that fixed on me with unnerving stillness. That gaze stopped me in place, froze me, as though he were measuring something deeper than my body, as though he were weighing my soul. He spoke. His voice was low and smooth, like aged whiskey poured into crystal. "You're awake." I clutched the blanket tighter around myself, suddenly and fully aware of just how vulnerable I was. I sat in a bed that wasn't mine, in a room that wasn't mine, with a man who wore nothing but a towel. "Where am I?" I asked, my voice shaky, betraying me. "What happened last night?" He walked to the wardrobe, opening a drawer with unhurried ease. "This is my penthouse. As for last night," he said, the corner of his mouth lifting into a vague, unreadable smile. "You drank too much. Your friends left you. I brought you here." My stomach clenched. "Did we?" I couldn't finish the question. "No." A single word, cold and certain. "I don't touch unconscious women, Grace." A deeper chill slid down my spine. How did he know my name? He turned then, one hand holding a shirt, the other sliding into his pocket. "I make it a point to know everyone who walks into my club, especially the ones who stand out." The way he said the word interesting made me feel like I'd been pinned under glass, a specimen to be observed. I reached for my phone. "Where is it? Your friends were informed you're safe." He nodded toward a chair. My purse was there. I rushed to it, unzipping with shaking hands. My phone lit up with 17 missed calls. My heart thudded. I stood, then froze, suddenly aware that I was still undressed. "Your clothes are being laundered. You were sick last night. There's a robe in the bathroom. Put it on." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. I stepped into the bathroom, slipping into the silk robe that clung to my skin like guilt itself. When I emerged, Julian was fully dressed in a charcoal suit, phone pressed to his ear, speaking fluent Italian in a voice that was deep but now laced with steel. I tried to slip past him to get to my bag, but he blocked me, his hand wrapping around my wrist with a touch that was firm, but strangely gentle. He ended the call, slipped the phone into his pocket, and looked at me with those same unreadable eyes. "Where are you going?" "Home." "Thank you for helping me. But I need to leave." He tilted his head slightly, eyes glinting with something like amusement. "No." I lifted my chin. "Excuse me, you can't leave, Grace. Not after what happened." He let go of my wrist, but his fingers rose to brush a lock of hair behind my ear. The motion sent a shiver down my spine, not entirely out of fear. Something inside me reacted. "What happened?" I asked. my voice beginning to carry the tremble of dread. He pointed to a tablet. I looked. Security footage from the bar. There I was, unmistakably drunk. 2 men approached. When I turned away, one of them slipped something into my drink. I went cold. The footage shifted. Julian appeared, said something. The men's faces changed. They work for Larson, my rival. They saw you with Rachel. Her brother works for me. He clenched his jaw. You were collateral. A warning meant for me. The room tilted slightly beneath me. So, you saved me? I let out a dry, humorless laugh. A hero in a blood-stained suit. Julian didn't laugh. This isn't a joke, Grace. They know who you are now, and they won't stop. I rose to my feet, a storm of emotions tightening in my chest. I went out to celebrate my birthday, and now I was caught in a Mafia war. Sit down. His voice was soft, but laced with iron. I sat. He continued, you have 2 choices. Leave here, go back to your old apartment in South Seattle, return to your cafe job, your night classes at the community college, and within a day, you'll be dead, or wish you were. My blood turned to ice. How do you know all of that? Or, he said, settling beside me so close I could feel his warmth. You stay. Here, under my protection, until I take care of this. I swallowed hard, whispering, how long? As long as it takes. He reached out and lifted my chin, forcing me to meet his eyes. There's no running now, no turning back. Not after I had stepped into Julian Maddox's world, and not after I began to feel that there was something in his gaze that made me want to believe, even if my heart was still trembling with fear. Before we dive deeper into the mysterious and tension-filled world that surrounds Grace, let's take a moment to pause. If you've been listening and find yourself drawn into this story, don't forget to subscribe to the Dear Single Mom channel, hit the like button, and share this video to help bring these powerful stories to more people. We post new videos every day, offering not only entertainment, but moments that speak to something real and deeply felt. Let us know where you're listening from by leaving a comment below. We would love to see where Grace's journey has found you, in whichever corner of the world you may be. And now, let's return to the story, where Grace is beginning to understand that she's no longer an outsider, but a part of this dangerous world in a way she never expected. I remained motionless long after Julian Maddox had left the room, his final words echoing in my mind like an undeniable decree. There's no turning back. I cradled my head in my hands, trying to piece together the scattered remnants of last night, but all I could grasp were fleeting fragments lost in the blur of pounding music and strobing lights, strange faces, a steady stream of cocktails, Rachel's laughter ringing in my ear. I had told myself I would only stay for a little while, just have one drink, then go home early. But I couldn't remember how I'd left. Only the throb in my feet from the heels I wore and the dizziness as I stepped off the dance floor. And now, I had awoken in the domain of a powerful man, a man who had calmly declared that I was bait in a war between hidden forces, Julian Maddox. A name that sounded both elegant and edged with danger, a man whose appearance belonged on the glossy cover of a financial magazine, yet whose gaze was cold enough to send a chill straight to the bone. He had saved me, but he was also the one keeping me here, locked in this gilded cage. I stood and walked to the window, staring out over a Seattle morning still veiled in mist. The cars crawled along the streets below, people starting their day, their lives moving forward in ordinary rhythms, while I was swept into a storm I hadn't seen coming. My phone still sat on the table. I reached for it on instinct, thinking to call Rachel, then stopped myself. If he was right, if Rachel was being watched, if her family had ties to Julian, that call could make everything worse. I turned to look around the room. Every detail was unsettlingly perfect. From the softness of the Persian rug beneath my feet to the precisely polished edges of every surface. The room didn't just speak of wealth. It spoke of control. This man commanded everything in this space, including me. I had never met anyone like him. Julian was unlike any man I'd ever known. He wasn't hurried. He didn't show off. Every word he spoke carried weight. Every movement warned others to tread carefully. There was something about him that frightened me, yet I couldn't look away. As if his eyes had the ability to strip away pretense, to see what lay underneath. He might not hold a gun to give orders, but he didn't need to. There was a stillness about him that pressed down on everything around him. And just as I was debating whether to call someone or find a way out, a soft knock broke the silence. A woman entered without a word, a silver tray in her hands. She placed it on the table near the window, bowed slightly, and left before I could even speak. Breakfast looked like it belonged in a 5-star hotel. Poached eggs, golden toast, carefully sliced fruit, and a steaming cup of coffee. The aroma stirred my senses and anchored me to the moment. I ate in silence, but my mind was racing. What was I in this story? A hostage or someone under protection? A victim or a pawn? Why would he care about me? Just a girl working part-time in a cafe, living on scholarships, connected to no one in his world. I remembered the way Julian had looked at me when he spoke of the video, how he knew my name, how he said it as though he had read through hundreds of files before deciding something. He hadn't been surprised when I woke up, as if everything that had happened this morning had already been calculated. The question formed clearly in my mind. Was he the one who saved me? Or had he merely initiated another dangerous game? I needed to know the truth before I could let myself believe anything. Once again, I looked out at the city through the thick, cold glass. Behind me was a door that led into a world I didn't understand. In front of me, the world I thought I belonged to looked distant, unfamiliar, like a dream that had dissolved in the light. And Julian Maddox, the man who held me here, might be the only one who knew the answer. Whether he was my savior, or the one imprisoning me with the very illusion of safety he had just offered, I hadn't decided yet, but I knew one thing for certain. He never did anything without a reason, and I had to find out what that reason was, before it was too late. The door opened again while I stood at the window, the coffee in my hand long gone cold, my mind still spinning with questions that had no answers. Julian stepped inside without knocking, without asking, as though he held not just the key to this space but to the thoughts circling inside me. He wasn't wearing the tailored suit from this morning. Now it was a black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his tie hanging loose, still polished, still dangerous, but somehow closer, more human. His eyes swept over me once, then he crossed the room to pour himself a glass of water. I had never felt silence carry so much weight. He sat down, set the glass on the dark wooden table, and kept his gaze fixed on me. "You have questions." His voice was calm, but it didn't feel like an invitation. It felt like a quiet command. I nodded and stepped closer, clutching the collar of the robe as if it were the last shield between me and a world I no longer recognized. Why me? He tilted his head slightly, and those amber eyes glinted with a sharp, icy light. "Because you're an innocent caught in a war that was never meant to touch you, and because I don't allow that to happen under my watch." I let out a laugh, dry and hollow. "So you saved me out of principle?" "No," he answered without hesitation. "I saved you because two men tried to use you to get to me. They wanted to send me a message. I sent one back. I took a half step back, the air around us thickening like smoke. So what now? I'm just some burden you have to hide until this war blows over." Julian didn't answer right away. He stood, walked toward the window where I'd been moments before, his eyes following the misty horizon over Seattle. "I know this isn't something you chose, but choice is in short supply right now." When he turned back, his expression had softened, shaded now with something quiet, something almost sorrowful. "There are two roads. One, you walk out of here, go back to your little apartment in South Rainier, back to making lattes at the Lantern, to your evening classes you're always late to because you're pulling double shifts. You can try to pretend last night didn't happen, but trust me, they know who you are. They've seen your face, and they don't need a second reason to act. You won't be safe." I swallowed hard, my throat dry as if the very air was closing in on me. I lifted my head, tried to keep the tremble out of my voice. "And the second road." He stepped closer, not quickly, not forcefully, but even so, I could feel the weight of his presence shift something in my chest. "You stay, here, under my protection, in this penthouse, with my security team, where no one touches you unless I say they can, until I clean those bastards off this city." My hands curled into fists, unsure whether I was trying to steady fear or anger. "Sounds like I don't have a choice at all." Julian shook his head. "You always have a choice, Grace. But every choice has its cost." I let out a bitter breath of laughter. "The cost of freedom is death, and the cost of safety is being caged in a place I didn't choose, with a man I know nothing about, except that he runs an empire built in the shadows." He didn't flinch. He didn't deny it. He didn't defend himself. He just looked at me, as though waiting to see what I would do with that truth. He said, "I don't hold women hostage, Grace. You're not shackled here. If you want to leave, I'll have someone take you home. But I'm telling you, don't be foolish." I stared into his eyes, torn in a dozen directions. I had grown used to no one worrying about my safety. I'd been looking after myself since I was 14, but Julian's gaze wasn't superficial. It was cutting, as if he could see the darker corners I never let anyone near. I turned and walked toward the door, every step tangled with thoughts I couldn't untangle. I need time to think. Julian nodded. You have time. But not much. Larson isn't a patient man, and I can't keep you safe if you won't let me. I paused at the doorway, not turning back, leaving only words behind. I don't know yet if I'm afraid of you or if I'm beginning to trust you. But if I decide to stay, it won't be because I've been backed into a corner. It will be because I choose to. Behind me, Julian said nothing. But I knew. The game had just officially begun, and I was no longer a spectator. I spent nearly the entire morning wandering through the penthouse, as if testing the truth of Julian's words about the choices I thought I had. No one stopped me. No one gave orders. There was no sound of clicking locks. No doors visibly barred. Everything was open. And yet, the truth was undeniable. I couldn't leave. These doors, though unlocked, felt like layers of transparent glass imprisoning me with their flawless design. I walked through the living room, vast as a hotel lobby, past a polished wall of wine cabinets, past a dustless grand piano that sat silent like a decoration no one dared touch. Each step echoed softly against the cold stone floors, a steady reminder that I didn't belong here. I tried the front door, and just as I suspected, it wasn't locked. But when I turned the handle, a quiet beep sounded, followed by a flat mechanical voice alerting me that the access card was invalid. I tried again, this time with more force, as if sheer willpower might be enough to break through. But nothing changed. The door was unlocked. I simply wasn't allowed to open it. I slid down beside the glass wall that overlooked the city, my arms resting on my knees, flooded with a feeling that hovered somewhere between frustration and helplessness. This apartment was a gilded cage, so beautiful it almost made you forget you were trapped inside. I hadn't seen Julian since our conversation that morning. I wasn't planning to seek him out. A part of me still resisted, still wanted to believe I had some say in this life I now found myself in. But as if he had read that thought, the elevator chimed softly, and Julian stepped out. He was back in his tailored suit, crisp white shirt, looking as if the tense exchange earlier had never happened. In his hand was a small black bag, which he handed to me without a word. I looked at him, then down at my hands as I unzipped it. Inside was a new phone, a soft leather notebook, and a keycard. He sat in the chair across from me, his fingers loosely laced atop his knee. The phone has a few numbers preloaded. One is yours, one is Marco's, and one is mine. I looked up at him, raising an eyebrow. 2 of your numbers. Julian's mouth twitched into a slight smile. 1 for when it's necessary, 1 for when you're scared. I didn't know whether that was supposed to make me feel safer or more afraid. He went on, his tone even. That keycard opens the front door, but it won't call the elevator unless the control room authorizes it, for now. I gave a soft, humorless laugh. So I still can't leave. You can walk out any time you want, Grace. But if you step outside not knowing who's waiting for you, I won't be responsible for what happens. That's not a threat. That's the truth. I clenched my fists but said nothing. I knew he was right. Not because I trusted him, but because I knew I wasn't equipped to defend myself if I really was being watched. He gestured toward the notebook. Write it all down. The anger, the fear, the doubts. Don't let it eat away at you in silence. I looked up, startled by the unexpected insight in his voice. Julian Maddox, the man who seemed to bend this city with a glance, was telling me to keep a journal. I didn't ask why, but I knew that here, everything had a reason. He stood and regarded me for a moment longer. You're not locked in, Grace. But if you're not ready, don't force yourself out there. In here, at least, you have a chance. When the elevator doors closed behind him, I looked around the apartment once more. Every door was open. And yet, the way out wasn't mine to take. And maybe what scared me most wasn't that I couldn't leave. It was that some part of me had started to feel safe inside this captivity. I didn't leave the apartment that day, not because I was forbidden to, but because I was no longer certain what or who I was trying to run from. I spent most of the afternoon in the small library tucked behind a wooden door at the end of the hallway, where soft light filtered through white silk curtains and fell gently across rows of shelves lined with dark leather-bound books. I wasn't really reading. My eyes moved over the words, but my mind remained tangled in the growing fog of unease swelling inside me. This illusion of safety, the thick silence pressing against the walls, and the invisible presence of Julian Maddox together. They formed a kind of haze I couldn't see through, couldn't break out of, making it hard to tell what was real, what was close, and what had already slipped too far away. By late afternoon, just as I was about to leave the room in search of something to eat, the door opened. Marco, The tall man I had passed briefly the morning before stepped inside, dressed in black, his face stern but not unkind. He gave a slight nod with the air of someone trained by discipline. "Julian requests your presence for dinner," he said. It wasn't a command, but it didn't feel like a suggestion either. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. A part of me wanted to see Julian again, to ask the questions that had been left unanswered. But another part, quieter and more stubborn, simply wanted to look into his eyes once more, to see if that strange feeling still lingered. Marco led me to a different floor, to a private dining room with high ceilings, glittering chandeliers, and a long table so wide that even two people sitting at opposite ends could make the room echo with silence. Julian was already there, seated at one end, a glass of red wine in his hand. He rose when I entered, pulling out a chair for me with the grace of a man from another time. "Are you all right?" I nodded, unsure what words would even fit this moment. Marco poured the wine, set down our plates, then disappeared without a sound. We began to eat, and nearly 10 minutes passed in silence before I finally spoke. "How many people have lived here?" Julian looked at me for a moment, then set his utensils down and leaned back slightly in his chair. "Only me, and now you." The answer caught me off guard. I had assumed he lived with someone family, a woman, or at the very least, a close circle of trusted friends. A place like this couldn't possibly belong to just one person. I glanced around the vast room, the warm golden lighting casting everything in a glow that almost tricked the eye into mistaking it for happiness. "What about the others?" I asked quietly. "The ones before me." He shook his head. "There was no one before you. I've never brought anyone here." I tried to mask my surprise, but Julian noticed. He continued, slowly, as if explaining something he didn't often put into words. "I don't bring people to this place, not because I'm hiding it, but because I don't trust anyone enough to share it." I studied him carefully. And me. He didn't flinch. "I don't know," he said, "but I do know this. If I let you leave without ensuring your safety, I won't be able to forgive myself." I drew a breath and set my glass down. "Why me? I'm just a girl who makes coffee, takes night classes, lives in a cheap apartment with mold on the walls and rats in the ceiling." Julian tilted his head, his voice softer but still steady. "You think you're ordinary, but you don't see how you walk into a room like you belong there. You don't see the way you look me in the eye when everyone else turns away. You don't realize you chose to stay when you could have run. That's not ordinary." I felt my throat tighten. Maybe I'd heard kinder words from others before, but no one had ever said them to me with such conviction. I looked at him again. Really looked. The man across from me no longer felt like a dangerous shadow in a world I didn't understand. He was a part of it, yes, but not entirely shaped by it. Like me, maybe he too was searching for a reason to believe he was more than what the world had labeled him. And maybe, like me, he was trying to trust something real, even if just for a moment. After dinner, he walked me back upstairs, saying nothing more. I stepped into the room, closed the door, and leaned back against it, my heart beating a little faster than it should have. I was the first person to be here, and in some strange, unsettling way, that made it harder to leave. I didn't know what woke me that morning. Maybe it was the soft gold light slipping through the thin curtains, or maybe it was the lingering trace of a dream I could no longer recall clearly, one where I wandered through a maze made of glass and stone, the sound of footsteps behind me never quite catching up. When I stepped out of the room, the apartment was wrapped in an unnatural quiet. No voices, no footsteps echoing from the elevator hall. For a moment, I thought I was alone, but then I heard it, a faint trace of music coming from a hallway to the left, one I hadn't explored. Like everything else in this place, the door wasn't locked. I pushed it open gently and found myself in a room flooded with light, perhaps the only space in the penthouse that didn't feel cold or distant. It was a workspace, but not like any office I'd imagined. Blueprints were everywhere on the walls, under the table, even unrolled across the floor. Lines, angles, notes, carefully written in black ink. In the center stood a large wooden table, and on it sat a meticulously crafted model. I had to lean in close to take it all in. A bridge. A stunning bridge stretched across an imagined river, detailed down to every railing, every seam. Julian was at the far end of the table, bent over with a small steel tool in his hand, adjusting something with the steady precision of someone used to building things that needed to last. He didn't look up when I entered, but his voice came, low and warm, as if he'd known I was there all along. "I always come here when I can't sleep." I walked closer, unsure if I was meant to touch anything. He glanced at me, saw my hesitation, and gave a small nod. "You can look." I let my fingers graze the edge of the tiny bridge railing, the wood smooth and cool beneath my touch. You made this. Julian nodded. I studied architecture before everything changed, before I became who I am now. I turned to him, unable to hide my surprise. I couldn't picture him, this man who commanded entire rooms with a glance, once being a student bent over sketches and blueprints. He gave a faint, dry smile, one that didn't exist in any file written about him. I used to think I'd build things. Now I mostly destroy them. I didn't know what to say. Something in that sentence caught in my chest, too heavy to ignore. He turned back to the table, unfurling another drawing, this one of a low-rise housing complex, surrounded by gardens, a pond, walkways that curved gently like they were meant to guide people home. My original dream, he said, was to create places where people could live and feel safe. No electric fences, no guards at the gate, just thoughtful design that made people want to stay. I looked down at the drawing, pencil strokes so careful I could almost hear the water flowing, the leaves rustling. Why didn't you do it? I whispered. He didn't answer right away. His hand smoothed over the paper like it was something too fragile to lose. Life takes turns we don't choose, Grace. I lost my family because of a foolish debt my father left behind. I had to teach myself how to survive in a world that doesn't make space for dreamers. And to survive here, you give up the best parts of yourself. My chest tightened. This man wasn't just a powerful figure in a world built on shadows. He was someone who once dreamed, once believed, and once lost. I turned to him, looked into his eyes. So what now? Do you still have that dream? Julian held my gaze for a long time. He didn't smile. His eyes were deep, pulling me toward something I hadn't seen before. It never left, he said. It's just been buried beneath layers of duty, of loyalty, and of the prices I've had to pay. But sometimes, when the night's too long, I sit here and wonder if I'd been born somewhere else. Could I have just been an architect? A man with a bridge named after him. I didn't know why my heart beat faster after he said that. Maybe because I understood what it meant to lose something before you ever got the chance to touch it. Maybe because in that moment, I saw the part of him he kept hidden, the part no one else had ever been allowed to witness. And I realized then I wasn't just the first person to be here. I might also be the first person to truly see Julian Maddox's dream. I was still haunted by the image of Julian, head bowed in silence over the bridge blueprint, when the sharp ring of a phone cut through the stillness of the room. Not mine. It was the phone he had given me, the one with only a few numbers stored in it. On the screen, Marco's name flashed. I answered. His voice was tight, urgent. You need to come downstairs. Julian wants to see you. Before I could ask anything, the line went dead. I threw on a jacket and followed the private elevator down to the lower floor. The meeting room was hidden behind a steel door secured by fingerprint access. When I entered, the air inside was thick, electric, as if something terrible was about to detonate. Julian stood at the edge of the table, his eyes sharp as a blade, fixed on the security footage playing on the large screen in front of him. I hadn't even spoken when he pointed at the screen. Look. I stepped closer. Rachel. She was walking alone on a sidewalk near the neighborhood we used to grab food after late shifts. But something was wrong. The light was pale, early morning maybe. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her pace quickening. The footage jumped. Another angle. A black car pulled up, hugging the curb. Two men stepped out. One pulled his hood tight, covering his face. They didn't hesitate. One grabbed Rachel from behind. The other threw the car door open. It was over in less than 10 seconds. The car peeled away into the darkness, gone before I could even breathe. My hands clenched so tightly I could feel my nails pressing into my skin. It felt like someone had slammed their fist straight into my chest. Julian looked at me then, and for once, his eyes weren't cold. They're sending a message. Last time, it was you. This time, it's your friend. They know you're with me, and they know I care about you. I stumbled back half a step, my pulse roaring so loud it drowned out everything else. I couldn't stay still, couldn't breathe normally. Rachel was the only person I had stayed in touch with since college, the only person who hadn't abandoned me when I had nothing. Julian stepped forward, his hand firm on my shoulder, grounding me. We'll get her back, I promise. But I need you calm. I need you to listen. I nodded, though my heart had already shattered halfway. Julian signaled to Marco, who spread a map across the table and pointed to the southern port district. This was the last known location of the vehicle, picked up by our plate recognition system. They moved fast, but not faster than my network. I stared at the map, my head spinning. If she's there, why haven't you gone in? Julian exhaled. Because if I send people in, They'll kill her immediately. This isn't a kidnapping for ransom. This is a warning, a strike. My body went cold. So what do we do? Just wait until they mail us a piece of her? Julian looked me straight in the eye. And this time, I saw no hesitation in him, only unwavering resolve. I allowed you to stay here because I wanted to protect you. But that doesn't mean I'll stand by and watch innocent people suffer because of me. You have to trust me. I have a plan. I didn't ask what that plan was. There was something in his voice that told me he would do whatever it took. But more than that, I understood something I hadn't dared admit until now. The world Julian lived in, where power was enforced, not by law but by fear and loyalty, didn't allow for mercy without consequence. Rachel's abduction wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration. And I, whether I wanted to or not, was now at the heart of it. I tightened my grip on the phone, staring once more at the final frame of Rachel on the screen. The way she looked back over her shoulder was seared into my memory. This time, I wouldn't run. Even if it meant stepping deeper into Julian Maddox's world, I couldn't turn my back on the one person who had never turned hers on me. Not this time. Not ever again. I sat motionless on the long bench in the library, the leather-bound notebook Julian had given me days ago lying open before me, untouched. For over an hour, I hadn't written a single word. My mind was a tangled thread pulled taut from both ends on one side. Rachel's face as she was dragged into the car, wide-eyed and terrified, and on the other, the raw instinct inside me screaming not to take another step deeper into this, warning that once I did, there would be no way back. I used to think I was strong. I believed I was the kind of person who didn't bend easily, who didn't let life shove her around. But right now, I felt like someone caught in a whirlpool, gripping a fragile branch called friendship, while behind me stretched the vast, dark unknown of a world I never wanted to belong to. I knew Rachel didn't deserve any of this. She had no part in it. She was just a friend who took me out for my birthday, unknowingly placing me in the crosshairs of Julian Maddox's enemies. But I was the reason she had been taken. I had stayed. I hadn't left when I had the chance. I had allowed myself to become part of this world, knowing full well how dangerous it was. And now, she was paying the price. I heard the door open behind me. Julian walked in, unannounced, as he always did. He didn't speak right away. He sat in the chair across from me, his hand resting lightly on the table, waiting for me to look up. "I know you're torn," he said. "Between running and staying. Between protecting yourself and protecting someone else. But there's no time left for doubt, Grace. They've already made their move. They won't stop just because you feel you shouldn't be involved." I raised my head to meet his eyes. "So what am I supposed to do? Walk out there and throw myself to the wolves? I'm not you, Julian. I don't have men. I don't have plans. I don't control a city with a single phone call. I'm just an ordinary girl. And my friend is out there somewhere, maybe being tortured, maybe being threatened every minute." Julian didn't argue. He didn't lecture. His gaze softened. "That's exactly why you're unlike anyone I've ever let into my life. Because even in all this cold, you still have a heart. But you're not just an ordinary girl anymore, Grace. Not from the moment you stepped into this place. Not from the second they chose you as a target. And especially not now, when you've decided not to turn your back on someone you love." I didn't speak. Not because of what he said, but because I knew he was right. Maybe I hadn't changed overnight, but each day here, each moment spent staring into the raw truth of this underground world, had chipped away the shell I once believed would keep me safe. And now, I couldn't look away. Julian opened a small black case beside him and placed a photograph and a file folder on the table. "They're holding Rachel in a warehouse near the abandoned eastern port. We've confirmed the location, but we don't know how many people are inside. If we go in hard now, the risk is enormous. They could move her, or worse." I looked at the photo, my heart twisting. A rusted metal building surrounded by chain-link fencing, tall weeds choking the ground, a place designed to disappear. Julian looked at me again. This time, he didn't give an order. He didn't try to convince me. He simply asked, "Do you want to come with me?" I stared at him, stunned. My heart was pounding. He nodded. "I'll let you watch from a safe distance. I want you to see what I'm willing to do to bring Rachel back. But if you want to leave, to end this right now, I'll have someone take you far away. No one will touch you. The choice is yours." I clenched my hands tightly, torn in ways I had never been before, but I knew the answer the moment I saw Rachel being pulled into that car. I nodded. "I'll go. Not because I'm not afraid, but because if I don't do something, I'll stop recognizing who I am." Julian gave a quiet nod, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "Then let's get ready." And for the first time, I stepped out of that apartment not because I was running, but because I was ready to face what waited for me. The car moved silently through empty streets, streetlights stretching into blurred streaks on the window glass. I sat in the back beside Julian, my nerves stretched thin, every breath sharp with tension. I had assumed we were headed toward the place where Rachel was being held, but Julian told me otherwise. We were going to a restaurant, a quiet, discreet one tucked deep within the city's old quarter, not for an ambush, not for a bold rescue, but for a negotiation, candles, wine, and cold-blooded men in tailored suits. Julian said it was the only way to keep Rachel alive without triggering the fury of wolves already circling. From the outside, the restaurant looked like an abandoned building, but inside, it was another world. Golden candlelight flickered from silver holders. Faint old jazz floated in the air like the scent of aged wine. We were led to a private room in the back, where 3 men were already waiting. At the center sat a short, heavy man with a bald, polished head and eyes like pepper seeds. Larson, Julian had mentioned him before. A man who could smile as he gave the order to put a bullet in someone's head. The kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to command a room. Julian pulled out my chair before sitting across from him. The 2 men stared at each other as if they were reading lines of invisible text in each other's eyes. No smiles, no greetings, no pleasantries. Larson lifted his wine glass, his tone light, like he was commenting on the weather. "I hear you've got a girl, and I've got one too. Quite the balance, don't you think?" I felt my whole body tense, but Julian's face remained unreadable. I didn't come to play games. I came to take back what's mine. Larson tilted his head. "Since when does Julian Maddox call a part-time barista his own? She's worth risking your reputation over. Is she?" Julian laced his fingers together on the table, voice calm as still water. "She means nothing to my organization, but she means something to me. I'd seen plenty of scenes like this in movies, but I never imagined I'd witness a life-or-death negotiation unfold over red wine and embroidered napkins." Larson laughed short, dry, humorless. "Then this is going to be fun. But you know the rules. Everything has a price. I want something from you, Maddox. If I don't get it, your little sweetheart's friend won't see the morning." My throat tightened, but Julian didn't flinch. He met Larson's gaze. "What do you want?" Larson leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "I want you out of the West District. Immediately. No men, no claims, no control. The West District." I didn't know much, but I remembered Julian telling me that was where he'd started a redevelopment project. A chance to build something clean, something that could be his first step out of the shadows. I looked at Julian. His eyes didn't waver, but I felt something fracture quietly inside him. Larson sipped his wine, savoring the taste of victory. "And you, Julian, you said you'd protect this girl, so here's your chance to prove it." The silence that followed stretched impossibly long. I didn't know what Julian was weighing in his mind, what equations of risk and consequence were playing out behind his eyes. But finally, he nodded. "Fine, but if she's not returned unharmed, you'll lose more than a piece of real estate." Larson smiled. A real smile this time. "I keep my word, Maddox. Tonight, my men will bring her to the agreed location. No injuries, no tricks. Game over." Dinner had yet to be served, but Julian was already rising from his seat. I followed him, my heart heavy. Once we reached the car, I turned to him. "You gave up something important to you, didn't you?" Julian stared straight ahead, his voice quiet, dark. "Not as important as your friend's life, or your safety." I looked at him for a long moment, then turned away. Inside me, something shifted a quiet storm, a mixture of gratitude and grief. And for the first time, I understood that between light and darkness, sometimes a person has to let go of the dream they hold dearest, just to hold on to the last piece of their humanity. The car rolled to a quiet stop in front of an old warehouse tucked deep within the southern industrial zone, a place untouched by the reach of streetlights, where the wind slipped through warped sheets of metal and let out a sound that could chill the spine. Julian stepped out first. I stayed where I was, heart pounding, caught in a storm of contradiction. I had prepared for this moment, imagined it dozens of times. Rachel bursting out of the shadows, tears streaming down her face as she ran into my arms. But now, as it was finally happening, all I felt was a hollow stillness. Not because I wasn't grateful, but because I knew that after this, nothing would ever be the same. Marco signaled. A black SUV approached slowly. No sirens, no music. The silence was absolute. The door opened. Rachel was the first to be pushed out. Her hair was tangled, her clothes wrinkled, cheap slippers on her feet. But she was standing, steady, her wide eyes scanning the dark like she didn't quite believe she was free. I threw the door open and ran. I wrapped my arms around her before she could say a word. She froze for a beat, then clung to me, her body trembling. I wanted to say something, anything, but my throat locked. She was alive. That was the only thought that mattered. Julian stood at a distance, watching us. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to take the moment for himself. When they led Rachel to another vehicle for medical care, I turned back to him. He didn't speak. He only gave a small nod, a silent promise kept. There weren't words big enough for what I felt. Thank you wasn't enough. Sorry wasn't either. Everything seemed too small compared to what he had just sacrificed. I walked to him, stopped just a step away. He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on the empty space where the SUV had disappeared. Will she be okay? I asked. Julian nodded. I've got people following her. No one will get near her again. I looked at him, my chest tightening. He had just given up a piece of his dream to save someone who meant nothing to his empire. And what about you? I asked softly. Are you okay? Julian turned toward me. His eyes weren't cold steel tonight. They were tired, and full of a sadness that had no name. I'm used to losing things, he said. But this one tastes different. I don't know what made me reach for him. Gratitude, maybe, or something deeper I couldn't yet name. But I touched his hand, just lightly, and he didn't pull away. He let it be. Let me remind him that he wasn't alone. On the drive back, I said nothing. Rachel was safe. But I wasn't sure I was. In a matter of days, I had witnessed the darkest corners of this city, stood on the thin line between life and death, between right and ruin, between salvation and destruction. I was no longer the girl who poured coffee by day and fell asleep over textbooks at night, dreaming of a simple life. And Julian, this man I once saw as a distant force of power, now existed in my mind as something altogether different. A man who once dreamed of building bridges no one ever let him finish. When we returned to the apartment, I stepped out of the elevator before Julian. I paused at my door and turned to look at him. Freedom, I whispered, finally returned. But no one tells you what it costs, and I'm not sure I know what to do with it anymore. He didn't answer. He just looked at me, his eyes heavy with everything we hadn't said. I stepped into my room and closed the door, leaning back against the cool wood. Out there was the world I once longed to return to, but in here was the place where I had begun to change. And maybe real freedom wasn't about leaving a place. Maybe it was about choosing what you stay for. I looked up at the ceiling, where soft light outlined every quiet edge. Everything had changed, and so had I. I returned to my old apartment on a gray afternoon, the kind of day where the sky sagged low and thin mist clung to everything like smoke, softening the edges of the familiar street until it all felt strangely foreign. The same creaky stairs led me to the third floor, each step groaning beneath my weight just as they always had. The walls still smelled of damp plaster and old paint. The hallway echoed with the same muffled cries of a child from the first unit near the stairwell. But I was no longer the girl who had once walked these halls each night after a shift, legs aching, carrying a small, stubborn hope that tomorrow might be easier than today. My fingers tightened around the ring of old keys. When I opened the door, the scent of time rushed out to greet me, musty and stale, like the faint slap of a memory you didn't ask for. Nothing had changed. The thin blanket I used to toss over the old sofa was still draped across its arm. The chipped cat mug I once drank from every morning sat silently on the table. Notes with fading ink clung crookedly to the fridge. The little lamp I bought on clearance from the corner store still cast that pale yellow light when I flipped the switch. Everything here was small, plain, simple. It was the place I had called home for years, and yet, as I stood there, I felt like a stranger. I sat on the edge of the bed, letting my eyes wander around the room as though I had stepped into someone else's past. The mattress was still sagging, the curtains too thin to block the sun, the ceiling stained with long-forgotten rain. Once, I had accepted all of this as just life. Now, it felt distant, like each object was quietly asking me, "Are you still who you were?" I opened the drawer under my desk, pulling out a pile of old bills, debt logs, unopened letters from school I'd never gotten around to answering. One by one, I laid them out, pieces of the person I used to be. I didn't know exactly why I came back. Maybe I needed to measure the distance between who I was and who I'd become. Maybe I was looking for proof that some part of me was still Grace, the girl who wanted nothing more than a quiet, stable life. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the emptiness blooming in my chest. The things that once made me feel safe now only made me feel confined. This apartment wasn't a place I could return to. It was part of a past I had already, unknowingly, stepped beyond. I took out my phone not to call anyone, but my eyes stopped on one name: Julian. I didn't text. I didn't delete it. I just stared, as if somehow, through the screen, he could hear the quiet confusion unraveling inside me. I wasn't who I used to be, but I didn't yet know who I was becoming. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I knew one thing with quiet certainty. This wasn't it. The daylight faded. Outside, the streetlights blinked on, casting soft glows into the room. I stood, pulled out a small backpack, packed a few personal items, a jacket, and the notebook. I locked the door behind me, not out of fear of losing anything, but because I knew I wouldn't be coming back. I stepped out of the building and took a long breath. The rain still fell, but it didn't bite the way it had before. I didn't know where I would go next, not exactly. But I understood now that being uprooted isn't always the same as being lost. Sometimes, it's the beginning of planting something new, a new life, a new self. And this time, I would be the one choosing where I belonged. I stood in front of the penthouse door at 3 a.m, my hand resting on the cold wooden surface, not yet knocking, but my heart already pounding like a war drum. The rain from earlier had long since stopped, but the air still held a chill, damp and quiet. The hallway light above cast a pale, tired glow onto my face, muted and subdued, like the reason that had brought me back here. I didn't know what I'd been expecting when I left my old apartment. I only knew that once I walked away, I couldn't seem to find a place where I felt calm enough to stay. The cafe where I used to work now seemed too small and too far removed. The underground train station made me feel like I couldn't breathe. The familiar streets were suddenly too loud, too fast, too crowded. I tried circling the city, tried calling Rachel, tried sitting in the same old corner of the library, hoping it might feel like it used to. But nothing did. Nothing helped. So I just kept walking. Like something unnamed was pulling me forward, and before I knew it, I was here, in front of Julian Maddox's door. I knocked 3 times, soft, but loud enough to echo in the silence of the hallway. No answer. I took a step back, breath caught in my chest. Part of me hoped he wasn't home. Another part wished the door would open that instant. Then came footsteps from inside, steady, calm, unhurried, as if he'd known I was coming. The door opened. Julian stood there in a gray t-shirt and dark pants. His hair was slightly tousled, eyes still clear, alert. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at me for a few seconds. And suddenly, all the reasons I'd rehearsed for being here fell away the moment our eyes met. All that was left was a weariness in my voice as I finally spoke. I don't know where I belong anymore. Julian said nothing. He simply stepped aside and held the door open. I walked in. The apartment was exactly as I remembered, quiet, grounded, the faint scent of wood, and the jasmine tea he always drank in the evenings, the soft amber glow from the overhead lights casting long shadows across the walls. I sat down on the velvet chair I always used to curl up in, knees drawn to my chest, arms wrapped around them like I used to when I didn't know where to start. He poured me a glass of water, set it on the table between us, then sat across from me. I thought I could go back, I said, staring down at the floor. I thought if I left here, left you, I could find myself again. But every place I went just made me feel more empty, and I hated that. Julian didn't interrupt. He let me speak. Let the truth I'd been carrying inside finally find its way out. I was afraid that staying here meant losing everything I used to be. But when I left, I realized I stopped being that girl a long time ago. I've changed, and I don't even know if that's a good thing or a bad thing anymore. Julian's voice was quiet, but firm. Change doesn't mean loss. Sometimes it's the only way we find something that fits more honestly. I looked up at him. Have you ever felt lost inside your own life? I asked. He nodded. Every day. But sometimes what makes us feel lost is exactly what makes us feel real. I sat in silence. Something stirred in me then. Something unnamed and vast. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But here, tonight, in this room, I knew one thing with absolute clarity, that in a life filled with crossroads, with choices I never thought I'd have to make, when the clock struck 3 and I had nowhere left to go, the only person I thought of was Julian Maddox. And maybe that was my answer. Julian didn't ask why I came, nor how long I planned to stay. He simply refilled my glass of water and sat beside me, as if my presence at 3 a.m. was the most ordinary thing in the world. We sat in silence for a long time, saying nothing, only the steady ticking of the wall clock, breaking the stillness, as if to remind us that time moved forward, no matter how tangled our hearts had become. I didn't know exactly when I began to see him differently. Maybe it was that night in the room filled with blueprints, when his eyes couldn't quite hide the ache of dreams unfinished. Maybe it was when he gave up a piece of his own power to bring Rachel back safely. Or maybe it had been building slowly, day by day, in every small moment, the way he looked at me, the way he said nothing when silence was more comforting than words, until he was no longer the image of a man who ruled a city from the shadows, but simply a man who carried wounds of his own and still managed to hold onto his humanity in a world designed to strip it away. I turned and found him already looking at me. There was no tension between us now. No masks. Just two people sitting across from one another, without anything left to hide behind. I asked quietly, "Have you ever regretted letting me into your world?" Julian held my gaze for a long time, as if weighing the truth carefully. Then he said, "No, not once. But I'm afraid. I'm afraid that one day, you'll look at me with different eyes. That you won't see me with trust or softness, but with distance, like I'm a stranger." My chest tightened, because I knew that fear. I had feared it too. Feared I wouldn't recognize myself in the mirror. Feared that being close to him meant losing who I once was. But the truth was, it was only when I stepped away from him that I truly lost direction. I set my glass down, hands trembling slightly maybe from what I was about to say, because I knew it would change everything. I didn't come here looking for a place to hide. I came because I chose to. Not because I was forced. Not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I want to stay. With you. Julian didn't respond right away. He only looked at me, and in his eyes was a quiet mix of surprise, gratitude, and a sorrow so old it had long stopped expecting anything. "I've grown used to losing things, Grace," he said, his voice lower, almost a whisper. "I once loved someone I thought I'd grow old with. But this world doesn't honor love. It only keeps what's strong enough to survive it." "I know," I said. "But if you keep living like love is something you have to outrun, you'll always be alone. And I don't want that for you. Not for the man I see when you're not trying to be anyone else." He reached up, brushed his fingers gently along my cheek. His eyes softened, like something long locked away inside him had finally found its way to the surface. "You don't know what you're stepping into," he warned. I nodded. "I know. But I also know that if I don't step forward now, I'll live with doubt and regret for the rest of my life." He gave a half smile, not quite full, but honest. A night with no conditions, no what-ifs, no later, only now, and a choice. He pulled me into his arms not to claim, not to command, but simply to offer a place to rest, a place where I could let go. There were no promises spoken, no illusions painted, just the quiet closeness of two people who had walked through hurt and found each other not to be saved, but to be seen. That night, I didn't sleep. I just lay beside him, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my ear, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have to pretend to be strong. I didn't have to be afraid of what came next. Because no matter how complicated life would get, no matter how many choices might lie ahead, I had already made the one I could never take back, and I didn't want to. Morning poured into the apartment in a soft, honey-colored light that slid across the polished wooden floors and warmed my face before I even opened my eyes. I hadn't slept deeply that night, but not because of restlessness or nightmares. I had stayed awake simply because I didn't want to miss a single second of being near Julian inside the quiet stillness shared between two people who had entered each other's lives through everything opposite, and yet somehow found a moment of peace. When I stirred, he was still there, sitting by the window, the light falling across his dark shirt, a thin stream of steam rising from the coffee cup in his hand. He was focused on something on his tablet, brow slightly furrowed in the way I'd come to recognize as concentration. But the moment he noticed I was awake, he looked over and smiled, not the polite, practiced smile I'd seen him give others. A real one, gentle, a little shy, almost surprised. I sat up, pulling the blanket around me, still half convinced the night before had been some kind of dream. "Is everything okay?" I asked. He shook his head slightly, his voice low and calm. "Nothing's wrong. It's just habit. I always wake before the sun." I nodded, then asked the question I hadn't been able to silence since the night before. "What will people in your organization think of me now? That I'm a debt, a distraction, the reason you gave up the West District, or just some weak girl being protected?" Julian set his coffee down and walked over. He didn't sit immediately. He just stood there, watching me with that familiar mix of seriousness and tenderness in his eyes. "You're not someone who was kept here anymore, Grace. You chose to stay, and that changes everything." I smiled faintly. Yes, I had chosen. I was no longer the girl who trembled in the living room on that first morning. No longer the girl who flinched at every turn, who only knew how to resist and retreat. I was still me, but a version now brave enough to look straight at what I truly wanted. I left the room and walked down the long hallway I'd once seen as a golden cage. The floor that used to echo with my every cautious step now felt different. Familiar, not threatening, but welcoming. The wide windows didn't make me feel small anymore. They let the morning in like an offering. Marco was already waiting at the end of the hallway. He wasn't surprised to see me. He just nodded, a quiet confirmation of something already understood. I had become part of this story, no longer an outsider on the edge. When I entered Julian's office, a few other men were already inside. They were deep in discussion, exchanging files, reviewing maps spread across the large digital screen. I stayed at the edge at first, intending only to wait. But then I realized I didn't want to just wait. I stepped forward, asked Marco a few questions, then moved closer to read some of the schematics and data. Julian glanced up, a flicker of surprise in his expression, but he didn't stop me. I knew I had a lot to learn, a world to adjust to, but I also knew I wasn't here to stand behind him forever. I was here to walk beside him. Last night was a choice. Today was a beginning. And from that moment forward, I was no longer a captive in Julian Maddox's story. I was the woman who stayed with full awareness, with intent. When the screen finally dimmed and the meeting drew to a close, Julian walked over to me. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "You know, if you keep going, there won't be an easy way back." I nodded. "I'm not here to go back. I'm here to move forward." He smiled, not the small, restrained kind. This one carried weight, pride, and something like peace. He placed a hand on my shoulder, gently, as if affirming something no words could capture. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't walking alone anymore. This wasn't about blind love or reckless impulse. This was my choice, because I had finally found where I wanted to belong. Not a place where I needed rescuing, but one where I had become strong enough to stand on my own. And in the light of that morning, I understood. Sometimes, the most important decision in life isn't to escape, it's to stay. 2 weeks after I officially stayed, Julian handed me a thick set of documents bound in a black leather folder. No warning, no elaborate explanation. It was just another morning. He walked into the kitchen while I was pouring tea, placed the folder in my hands, and said in his usual even tone, "You should take a look at this." I brought it out to the balcony, where the early sunlight filtered through the distant trees, casting warm patches across the slate-gray tiles. Inside wasn't anything I expected. No files from the organization, no strategic layouts or reports from disputed zones. What lay between those pages were architectural blueprints, hand-drawn sketches intertwined with high-resolution digital renderings, and on top, a single handwritten note from Julian in his neat, precise script. "This is the dream I thought I'd never get to build. Will you help me build it?" I sat for a long time without moving. It was the southern edge of the city, a stretch of land scarred and forgotten after years of neglect. Julian had once told me that he grew up there, that it was the only place that had ever felt safe before the underworld claimed him. And now, after everything he had lost, he still wanted to rebuild it, not for himself, but for the children who were once just like him. Each blueprint held a piece of hope: a community center, a public library, a vocational school, a vegetable garden. Even a small cafe with wide windows looking out into a green space. Every structure carried a working name in Italian, a quiet homage to the memory of his mother. I reached the final page, a concept draft with a penciled note in the margin. "Need someone who understands the bridge between design and people. Maybe Grace." And in that moment, something in my chest softened, not from pressure, but from the overwhelming tenderness of it. Julian wasn't just offering me a project. He was handing me a part of his life, the part he'd once believed no one else would ever be allowed to touch. When I returned inside, he was at his desk, eyes on the screen, but I knew he was waiting. I sat beside him, didn't say much, just held the folder in my lap, and looked at him. "I think we should start with the library," I said quietly. "It needs to have enough natural light, and maybe we could add an outdoor reading area." Julian turned toward me. There was a quiet flicker in his eyes, recognition, maybe even relief. He didn't ask why I hadn't said no. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded once. "Then we'll start there." The days that followed took on a rhythm I had never known before. I worked with the design team, met with architects Julian trusted, learned how to read construction diagrams, sat through city zoning meetings. At first, there were looks, doubt, skepticism. I was young. I wasn't from their world. But I listened. I asked the right questions. And when I pitched the idea for a shared space that combined vocational training with mental health support, something shifted. They started listening back. I didn't do it alone. Julian was always there, quietly watching over things, stepping in only when I needed him. There were moments I expected him to take over, to decide for me, but he never did. He let me lead, as if this dream no longer belonged to him alone. One afternoon, I was adjusting the lighting scheme for the library's model when he came over, studied the design with a quiet intensity, then said, almost to himself, "I never thought someone like you would be part of this part of my life." I looked up at him and held his gaze. "Maybe that's because I didn't walk in with a plan," I said. "I walked in with feeling." He nodded slowly, saying nothing more. But I knew that from that moment, I was no longer someone who stood behind him. I was his partner, not just in this project, but in everything that would come next. And that truth, quiet and unspoken, made me feel stronger than I had ever been. Not because I was protected, but because I was trusted. That morning, I stood on the small stage of the university hall, where the lights shone directly into my face, making me blink over and over again. From the audience below came a wave of applause, the familiar faces of old friends, professors, acquaintances, and even those who once believed I would never come back to finish my degree. But I did it. Everything began with a small decision. On an evening when I was reviewing the design for the community bookstore, and Julian walked in, handing me an envelope. Inside was an invitation to a special re-enrollment program for students who had previously dropped out due to personal hardship. He must have researched and planned it long before. He simply said, "You don't need to throw away your past to begin again. You just need to continue it the right way." I hesitated, not because I doubted my ability, but because I feared that going back would erase the person I had become. But then I understood that sometimes, to move forward, we must finish the chapters left unfinished. So I studied and worked at the same time. During the day, I joined presentations, research groups, and completed the thesis I had once abandoned. At night, Julian and I would sit side by side, discussing each brick, each drawing, each investment for the redevelopment project. The first few weeks were exhausting, and there were moments when I thought I couldn't do both. But every time I felt like giving up, Julian was there, not with big speeches, but with a quiet presence. He would place a cup of tea beside me or pull up a chair and sit in silence. He didn't push me forward. He simply stayed long enough for me to remember why I started. And then, on a morning in June, I held my newly printed diploma in my hands, my name resting neatly beneath the words Bachelor of Community Design and Development. I didn't cry the way I had imagined. I just stood there for a long time, letting everything inside me settle like a warm summer breeze drifting through a life once filled with storms. Julian came after the ceremony, not in a suit, no flowers or congratulations. He simply handed me a plane ticket, one way, to San Francisco. I opened it, stunned into silence. He said it casually, "There's a community architecture conference there. I think you should be there. Not for me, for you, because it's time you stepped out into the world, not just within the circle of my arms." I held the ticket tightly, not out of fear, but because I knew this mattered more than any exam. This was the final test of everything I had chosen. I went. 1 week in a windy coastal city, where I met new people, shared my story, listened to other projects, and realized what I brought with me wasn't just skill, but a perspective shaped by something very different. I was no longer the night student struggling to juggle work and school. I was someone who had lived through a world of harsh choices and chose kindness. I chose to build, not to destroy. When I returned, Julian picked me up at the airport. He didn't ask what I had learned or who had impressed me. He only asked, "Who did you feel you were among those people?" I answered after a brief pause. "I'm someone who no longer needs to run away from where I once got hurt. I can go back and rebuild it." Julian nodded, and in that moment, his eyes no longer held the gaze of a man in control, but the quiet belief of a companion. I no longer felt small, like I had that first day standing at the edge of his world. Now, I could look straight ahead, even if the horizon was still uncertain, because I had been reborn, not by throwing away the past, but by rising from it, holding a new diploma in my hand and a heart that had learned how not to be afraid anymore. I don't know exactly when I began to see Julian not just as a powerful figure, but as the man who once dreamed of building bridges. Maybe it was the evening I sat in his office, beside the city map on the wall, where the red pins had started turning into real, breathing restoration projects. Or maybe it was when I watched him carefully handwrite a letter to a struggling high school, offering to fund a vocational program for underprivileged students. Julian never said it outright, but in the way he looked at the world, I recognized something deeper than any promise. He had never forgotten that bridge from long ago, the one he dreamed of as a boy standing beside a cold river, hoping one day to connect a city split by poverty and despair. But life never gave him the road to become an engineer. It threw him into the black market, the underground tables of poker games, the ruthless backrooms where the strong survived with wit and blood. Julian didn't choose that path because he loved it. He chose it because it was the only one he knew that would keep him alive and allow him to protect what was left. But now, after everything after power had settled in his hands like cold steel, he didn't use it to destroy. He used it to build, not bridges of cement or steel, but invisible ones, bridges that connected people to hope. One autumn afternoon, I arrived at the redevelopment site to prepare for a community talk, and saw Julian standing alone beside the newly built playground. He wore a gray button-down, hands in his pockets, eyes quietly following a group of children spinning on the carousel. In that moment, he didn't look like the man who ran an empire. He looked like someone ordinary, watching over something he had built with quiet resolve. When I walked closer, he didn't turn around. He just said, "When I was their age, I used to wish I could play in a park without worrying about being chased off or robbed." I replied softly, "Well, now they have somewhere to belong. Because of you." Julian was silent for a long moment, then finally turned to look at me. "I never meant to be a king," he said. "I just wanted to survive. But once I had power, I realized surviving isn't enough. You have to live for something." I nodded. "Because power is just a tool. What matters is what the person holding it chooses to do." He smiled, one of those rare, genuine smiles I had never seen during the early days. Then he took my hand. Not like a man claiming a woman, but like someone who had lost everything and now finally knew how to cherish the small, fragile thing being placed in his hands. Julian once wanted to build a bridge, but life forced him to raise a kingdom in the shadows. And instead of letting it swallow him whole, he turned it into a foundation, a beginning. I understood that more deeply than I could explain because I was the one who had seen the man in him when no one else dared to. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't clean, but he was real, and that made him more trustworthy than anyone who'd ever used morality to mask cowardice. When we left the redevelopment site, Julian opened the car door for me, just like he always did. But this time, before I stepped in, he paused, looked at me, and said, "Thank you for not leaving." And I answered, "I never stayed out of pity. I stayed because I saw something you'd forgotten. You're not just surviving anymore. You're alive. And what you're building, it's not power. It's hope." Julian didn't say anything more. He just placed a hand gently on my back, soft as wind. And in that moment, I knew the boy who once dreamed of building a bridge had done something even greater. He had built a kingdom. And most importantly, he no longer stood in it alone. I am not Cinderella. I have never been the girl who lost a glass slipper and waited for a prince to appear and pull her out of a narrow life. I never dreamed of a castle, a grand ball, or a kiss that would wake me from some enchanted sleep. My life didn't begin with a curse or end with a miracle. It was woven from small decisions, sleepless nights, fleeting moments of panic stitched together with fragile threads of hope. And then one day, when I found the courage to look in the mirror and no longer saw the girl who once trembled in the world of Julian Maddox, I realized I had become a woman who knew exactly what she wanted. Julian never tried to turn me into someone else. He never called me a princess. He never promised to protect me forever. Instead, he gave me the truth. Sometimes, it was raw, even brutal, the kind where power and pain coexist, like the two faces of a coin. But that was exactly what made me choose to stay. Not because he was powerful, but because he was real. I remember one evening, the two of us sitting on the balcony, the night wind cool against our skin, the soft lights of the city flickering in the distance. Julian handed me a glass of wine and asked, "If you could go back in time, would you change anything?" I thought for a long time. Then I answered, "I wouldn't change a thing, because if none of it had happened, I wouldn't know what I'm capable of becoming." He nodded, lips curling slightly, but his eyes turned solemn. He said, "I used to think the only way to keep someone was to control them. But you taught me that love isn't about holding on. It's about giving someone the space to choose to stay." I smiled. Because when a woman knows what she wants, she doesn't need rescuing. She needs to be respected. In the days that followed, I stepped deeper into the redevelopment project not just as a design advisor, but as a bridge to the community. I organized small gatherings, listened to stories from people who had been left behind. I visited single mothers, orphans, and those who believed they had no future beyond the shadows. And I shared my own story, not polished, not guarded, just honest. The story of a woman who had once been afraid, had once lost her way, but found herself again by walking straight through that fear. I realized the greatest thing Julian and I were building wasn't just structures. It was trust. It was a sense that everyone deserves another beginning. One late afternoon, I stood on the rooftop of the first completed building, looking down at the streets slowly coming back to life, and I knew I was no longer the lost girl I once was. I was the woman who chose to stay, who chose to love a complicated man, who chose to remain in a world full of contradictions, and not run from it. I am not Cinderella. I never was, and I never wanted to be. I don't need a fairy tale to change my life. I walked through every crossroads myself. I know who I am, and I know what I want. Not a happy ending wrapped in magic, but a journey that is real, resilient, and worthy enough to call my life. That night, I didn't return to the small apartment that had once been my refuge for so many years. Not because I had forgotten it, or no longer cherished the memories tied to that space, but because I had found somewhere else that made me feel like I belonged. A place that didn't need locked doors to guard against fear, or thick walls to muffle the sound of late-night tears. A place where I could walk in carrying all my wounds, doubts, and past scars and still be accepted for exactly who I was. That night, I chose to stay with Julian, not because I needed a protective embrace, but because I knew I was standing beside a man who was also learning how to be reborn, who was also searching for a different way to live in a world that had offered him too much darkness. And what mattered most was that we didn't need to rescue each other, we just needed to walk side by side. I didn't go home that night, and I no longer needed to. Because I understood home isn't an address. It's not 4 walls or a number on a door. Home is where you can be your whole self, without having to hide. Where you don't have to be strong in order to be respected. Where your heart can find peace, even when the world outside is full of storms. My story might not sound like a fairy tale. There's no magic, no princess, and definitely no perfect ending. But it is the journey of a woman who once stood at the edge of loneliness, who thought her life was nothing more than a patchwork of survival, who had to choose between giving up or trying one more time. And then, with one brave decision, she chose to believe in healing, to believe in a different kind of future. This story isn't just about me, or Julian. It's about anyone who's ever felt not enough, who's ever been lost in their own choices, who's ever been exhausted by a world that moves faster than their heart can follow. And if you've stayed with me until this very moment, I just want to ask you, how did this story make you feel? Did something resonate with you? Have you ever had a night where you didn't return, not geographically but emotionally? If so, I'd love to hear from you. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story meaningful, if it might bring comfort or hope to someone out there, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Dear Single Mom, so we can continue to walk through more real, heartfelt stories together each day. Because all of us, no matter where we've been or what we've lost, we all deserve to be loved, to be understood, and to live a life that feels a little more whole with every step forward. Thank you for staying until the very end of today's video. I wish you good health, joy, and a sense of peace in every choice you make. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.